Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Battleship Bismarck Part 27. The way into captivity began by leading Yunak and me from Newcastle to London. After a train ride in a pleasantly outfitted first-class compartment purposely secluded from the travelling public, we reached the London District Cage in the Kensington district, which served as a sort of shuttle station for newly arriving prisoners of war. The so-called cage was located on Kensington Palace Gardens Road, otherwise known as Millionaires Row, which ran along the west side of Hyde Park. No one could have foreseen that today it would serve as the chancellery of the Soviet embassy. The cage was operated by the British Army for the initial confinement of prisoners of war. Its commander was a major of Boer origin, a thick-set, grey-haired, hard-boiled and taciturn man with a thin mustache, who spoke a very good guttural German. The major himself was not authorized to interrogate prisoners, but he willfully disregarded this restriction from the start. The Royal Navy and the Air Force repeatedly had to complain that the major was present at initial interrogations by their representatives. He noted what had not been answered and afterwards grilled the prisoners with sledgehammer tactics. Some prisoners were manhandled and even beaten. By this method, the major certainly succeeded in obtaining one answer or another, but it was very frequently false. In any case, prisoners who had been treated in this manner were spoiled for further interrogations, so the major became involved in many discussions with the Navy and Air Force over his methods. In the case of captured naval personnel, representatives of the Royal Navy decided whether these should be transferred to a regular camp immediately or first subjected to an examination. During their visits to the cage, they did not actually interrogate the prisoners and never in the least intensively. They merely noted the naturally talkative, the former holders of important commands, and those who openly declared themselves ready to cooperate. The latter were without exception enlisted men. Some of them had come from the merchant navy and remained communists at heart. Members of these three categories were candidates for dispatch to the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, CSDIC, in the Cockfosters district. From the beginning, as Bismarck's senior surviving officer and as one of the ship's gunnery officers, I scarcely doubted that I would be questioned at the interrogation center. This center, which we always referred to simply as Cockfosters, lay inside Trent Park, opposite the northernmost station of the Piccadilly Underground Line. It was a majestic 18th century mansion, whose magnificent, gently rolling grounds, then closed to the public, included a wood, a lake, a golf course and tennis courts. Converted into an interrogation center after the beginning of the war, the estate had formerly belonged to Sir Philip Sassoon, the art connoisseur, who had filled the house with choice furniture and paintings, which the army had replaced with simple government-issue furnishings. But it was still evident that in time of peace the upper 10,000 had gathered here for romantic parties at which the guests, well shielded from the eyes of the uninvited, had frolicked in the garb of 18th century shepherds and shepherdesses. Now the British Navy, Army and Air Force had their respective offices on the ground floor, the interrogation rooms were on the second floor and the prisoners' cells on the third. 180 centimeters tall, slender, high-domed forehead. After my arrival at Cockfosters, I heard these and other descriptive phrases applying to me being said in a loud voice. It belonged to a powerful man in his late 50s with bristling hair and a distinctly Teutonic appearance, who obviously made quick work of routine. I soon found myself alone and, as it turned out, following policy to isolate new arrivals, separated for 3 months from other Bismarck survivors in a rather roomy cell on the top floor. Its barred windows provided an extensive view of lawns, lake and forest, a seeming island of idyllic peace in a warring world. Of course, on the far horizon, the barrage balloons tethered over London recalled reality. In my cell, however, there was only me and time in an apparently endless perspective. In the hall outside of the cell there was a little library with German and English books. It was very mixed. I saw Max Brod's Tycho Brahe's Weg zu Gott, Pettigrews Jungfrau von 18 Karat and more of the like. I read constantly whatever interested me, but soon I was brought out for interrogation, for which, after all, the Cockfosters camp was chiefly equipped. By May 1941, the British had developed 3 methods for pumping prisoners of war. The first and most frequently employed, and also favored at Cockfosters, was direct questioning. If the prisoner was cooperative, either from the start or because of a degree of pressure, this was the most effective method. Its success depended on a large extent on the amount of information already available to the interrogator, his experience, and his skill in handling the prisoner. As a rule, he was already familiar with the latter's unit, its leading personalities, and state of technical development. Such information was available mainly from the questioning of other prisoners or from secret sources. At Cockfosters, since the beginning of the war, the British had, through the interrogation of captured crewmen, gained considerable knowledge of the German U-boat arm and had developed a routine in regard to interrogating its members. But no one there had even the slightest idea about German battleships, and the shock at the sudden prospect of examining 1,000 or 2,000 Bismarck survivors was substantial. What, in God's name, should one ask them? It was therefore a deliverance when only a few more than 100 men appeared. I myself was interrogated by two periodically alternating interpreters. One was Lieutenant Commander Bertram Cope, a sturdy man in his late 50s who had drawn up my warrant upon my arrival at Cockfosters. He had learned his German in the Thomas Cook Travel Service and was a little rough around the edges, yet not unpleasant upon acquaintance. The other was Dick Weatherby, about 24 years old but older seeming, of average height, thin, with pitch-black, shiny hair. He came from a good Wiltshire family which, as the hereditary keepers of the stud book, the Register of English Thoroughbred Racing Horses, had a name in society. His background included an academic schooling in German and an extended pre-war visit to Germany. Without a profession at the outbreak of war, he had joined the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve and completed a 6-month sea training course for junior officers. He did not go to sea, however, but was attached to the staff of Naval Intelligence Department, which had a desperate need for German speakers knowledgeable in naval matters. Like the other interrogating officers, he had never been trained for this activity, but was assigned to it at random. It may well be that his rather threatening exterior, his character, and temperament helped him with his assignment. Head and neck like a cobra, many had said about him, yet he was friendly, super persuasive, occasionally furious, but without actually feeling the anger he displayed. As an interrogator, he was a natural talent, probably the best in Cockfosters. I no longer recall in detail the questions put to me by Cope or Weatherby in repeated sessions. From the beginning, there was something different in the case of Bismarck from that of most of the U-boats whose crews had been lost or captured. The invisibility that characterized their operations often made their mission a puzzle. Therefore, the British focused their relentless curiosity on the where and when, but the great battleship had been pinpointed by the British almost continuously. From her arrival at the Kattegat on the morning of May the 20th until her sinking 400 nautical miles west of Brest on May the 27th. The position and course of Bismarck thus lay more or less open to view. The answer to the question of the ship's mission I kept to myself. At any rate, it was not hard for the British to figure it out. So, the questions concentrated on Bismarck's technical characteristics. Two of them were repeated with great regularity. The first, how large was Bismarck? Which I always answered with 35,000 tons. The second, is it true that some of our torpedoes bounced off ineffectually on hitting Bismarck? To which I replied, no idea. The latter question arose from the worry that over the course of time an apparatus might have been developed in Germany that made British torpedoes harmless. In any event, we hadn't had it in Bismarck. Our interrogator's interest in the technical aspects of the Bismarck was, no doubt, also inspired by the wish on the part of the Admiralty to gain knowledge about her sister ship, Tirpitz. Winston Churchill was quite concerned with her too, and my knowledge of Bismarck would have been invaluable to any attack the Royal Navy would launch against Tirpitz. However, I did not see myself in a position to oblige. The second method of pumping prisoners consisted of bugging their cells with a hidden microphone. Thus, it was possible, for example, to overhear conversations between members of the same German unit before they were directly interrogated for the first time. This method proved especially productive for the British. On one hand, through the factual knowledge gained, on the other, for the helpful starting point it provided for direct questioning. The disadvantage was that the conversations could not be steered from outside. Yet, in certain ways, the conversations could be prepared, sometimes already in the cage. There, the interrogators would address the interesting points that could not be clarified immediately in an energetic but not unduly pressing manner. They expected that these would stick in the prisoners' minds and later be raised in conversations between cellmates. At Cockfosters as well, these methods brought the British by far the richest results, although at this time only 2 or 3 cells there were bugged. This low number was imposed by the relatively large number of army personnel needed to cover each cell 24 hours a day. listener, transcriber, and translator. Their work was bothersome and tiring. They were not expected to do it for longer than 2 consecutive hours. According to Donald McLachlan's Room 39, prisoners had already been warned of the risks of being overheard before entering their cells. This was in no way the case with me personally. I took it as a given, however, and my assumption was reinforced by my experience in the time to come. Days of isolation alternated with those in the company of other prisoners of war. For a while, Wohlfahrt was quartered with me. He had lost his U-556 to the depth charges of a British corvette a month after the sinking of Bismarck. What a surprise and joy it was to see our Sir Parsifal again, our sponsor, who in the last desperate hours of May the 26th had been so completely helpless to aid his protégé, Bismarck. We two together, wow, they'd really like to listen in on us, I said to him upon his arrival. We'll keep completely numb then, he said. So we played Skat, the most popular German card game, continuously. After Wohlfahrt came an officer from a German auxiliary vessel that had been lost in the Atlantic, then a fighter pilot. For me, this was a very welcome change. Each time we were supposed to be stimulated to conversations that would be profitable to our listeners. Always I warned my new companions of this danger, and I don't believe that we ever served as a source of secret information to our wardens. The third method of pumping prisoners consisted of the planting of so-called decoys. Originally recruited from emigrant circles and later from prisoners of war, they were carefully prepared for their role, in which they would win the confidence of prisoners to be tapped and lead them into conversation. Trained by the British Army, there were 49 during the course of the war. They proved themselves thoroughly successful. However, they never posed as members of the same branch of service as the prisoners being pumped. That would have made a risk of discovery too great. I personally was never confronted with this method at Cockfosters. All the information elicited from German prisoners was relayed to the subsection German Prisoners of War in the Germany section of the Naval Intelligence Department in London. The head of this subsection was Colonel B.F. Trench of the Royal Marines, who in 1910, it may be of some interest, had been sentenced to 4 years of fortress confinement in Germany after had been caught in too close an inspection of the guns in the fortress of Borkum. Trench, for his part, forwarded the information gathered from the prisoners of war, properly worked up, to the chief of the German section. From him, after it had been checked against other sources, the information went to the chief of the department, the director of naval intelligence, Rear Admiral John Godfrey, in a room 39 destined for historical fame. A sharp-witted, energetic man, Godfrey placed great demands on his subordinates and could be obnoxiously impatient, but spared himself least of all. The crème de la crème of the British intelligence service was assembled in and around Room 39. Naval specialists, civil experts from the Naval Reserve, university professors, scientists, attorneys. Here the entering information was definitely analyzed, accepted or rejected, and a decision made about what to send the operations sections for further action. 2 examples illustrate the successes Cockfosters brought Room 39, and 3 the reverses when Room 39 discounted information from Cockfosters. First, the successes. My interrogator's questions concerning the suspected ineffectiveness of British torpedoes bouncing off Bismarck, answered by my no idea, had its origins, unknown to me at the time, in the area of German torpedo failures. The first U-boat personnel captured by the British had complained bitterly among themselves about the numerous failures of their torpedoes to detonate. Mutually, they had consoled themselves in the expectation of new acoustic torpedoes that would follow the target's vessel's propeller noises, with which German U-boats would soon be armed. Cockfosters forwarded this bugged self-exposure to Room 39. In consequence, the British developed a protective device against the future threat, the so-called Foxer. This consisted of nothing more than 2 steel rods towed behind the British ship at an appropriate distance. The metallic noise produced by their banging together would attract the acoustic torpedo away from the ship's propeller to the rods, and it would detonate at a safe distance from the vessel. The Foxer was ready before the Germans had their acoustic torpedoes at the front, and despite the technical deficiencies connected with it, for a while it contributed to saving many an Allied ship. In routinely censoring captured German naval officers' mail, the Naval Intelligence Department noticed at an early date that in their letters U-boat officers were using a simple code based on the symbols of the Morse code. The dashes and dots of the Morse alphabet, as well as the separation marks between these letter symbols, were reproduced through 3 groups of letters into which the alphabet had been divided for this purpose. The secret information was concealed in the first letters of the words in the text of the letter. Of course, this type of code limited the writer's freedom of expression, but it still left him enough to compose a sufficiently natural-seeming text which did not openly betray the encoding of a very different sort of message than the one that was outwardly evident. In this manner, U-boat personnel were to report to their commander how, among other things, they had lost their boats and been made prisoner. Initially, Cockfosters let all this information go through uncensored in the hopes of catching a bigger fish, and that was on the way. In the summer of 1943, a German U-boat officer in the Bowmanville camp in Canada used the letter code to request the U-boat High Command to send a boat to the country's east coast. There, it would pick up several officers who were to have participated in a mass breakout from the camp and carry them back to Germany to rejoin the undersea war. This letter was no masterpiece of apparently innocent phraseology and had a number of artificially arranged substantives, striking enough, but the representative of the Naval Intelligence Department in Ottawa noticed nothing, despite years of indoctrination in the code by way of London. So, the letter, completely unnoticed by Ottawa, reached its goal and was rewarded by a letter from the commander agreeing to the operation and transmitting the organizational details. In contrast to the request, the commander's reply was extremely adept in its choice of words, completely natural seeming and absolutely innocent. No wonder that Ottawa did not notice anything or even subject it to a cursory scrutiny. Then, by pure accident, the British came to the rescue. Since 1942, Ralph Izard, a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy and member of the Naval Intelligence Department in London, had been in Washington as a visiting instructor training American officers in the examination of German prisoners of war. As the reply had come from Dönitz personally, for this and no other reason, Ottawa reproduced it as an object of presumably general interest for its postal distribution list and also sent a copy to Izard in Washington. The latter, who had just thoroughly explained this very letter code to his students, immediately began to decode the letter purely out of routine as a teaching aid in view of the apparently harmless contents without special expectations, in the self-evident certainty that Ottawa, technically competent, had long before gone over the ground for him. But, what a surprise. Peeled away, there it stood in black and white that U-536 would appear in Chaleur Bay to pick up German U-boat officers after a breakout from camp. The exact date would follow. Izard's congratulations to Ottawa. That was well done, but in Ottawa nothing at all had been well done, the content of the letter had been overlooked. Izard's congratulations informed the authorities of the alarming situation for the very first time. Now, it was up to the Allied planners to build a trap in which to catch the expected escapees and to ensnare, to destroy, better yet to capture U-536. The Naval Intelligence Department and the Canadian Army and Navy went to work. They chose to let the German plan unfold without hindrance while they secretly readied their countermeasures and then strike at the last possible moment with the maximum chance of success. For the Germans, who continued to believe themselves unwatched, everything seemed to click, even if in the end only a single officer, Wolfgang Haidar, succeeded in breaking out on September the 24th. But when he reached the rendezvous point on the coast, awaited with anxious satisfaction by the British and Canadian authorities, where he was to give the pre-arranged light signals to U-536 to send a rubber boat to the beach, the heavy hand of a Canadian Coast Guardsman came down on his shoulder. "You're under arrest." A completely independent organization, the Coast Guard had known nothing of the operation in progress, nothing of the trap that the Canadian Army and Navy together with the British had readied for the Germans, the trap which, in ignorance of the planned course of events, it had just ruined. Ottawa had neglected to inform it. Under the circumstances, what else could the lone wolf Haidar be for the Coast Guardsman than a suspicious stranger in a prohibited area? And so it came about that U-536, punctually entering Chaleur Bay, never received the pre-arranged light signals. Instead, it received the radio request, "Come, come," from the British naval officer who, with the help of a whole group of destroyers, was directing the entire operation against U-536 and the escapees from the shore. The stir caused by Haidar's arrest had drawn his attention, and he had already greeted the would-be escaper with the question, "Well, now, are you the gentleman who was to be picked up here by German U-boat?" Astonished, Haidar realized that it was over for him. "Come? What the hell does this mean?" Rolf Schauenburg, the captain of U-536, asked himself. This was by no means the agreed-upon radio message, and furthermore, it was on the completely wrong wavelength. The secret radio transmitter at Bowmanville was supposed to have reported the successful breakout on an entirely different wavelength, but nothing had been received from it, and now there was no light signal from the beach either. Growing suspicious, Schauenburg halted, turned about, and for fear of surprises submerged to the bottom and lay there, waiting. No sound must come from the boat now, and then the submarine chasers burst into action, their propellers churning nauseatingly near, depth charges crashing. But in the end, with much patience and skill, Schauenberg escaped back to the open sea with a practically undamaged boat, ready for new operations in another area. But why, he kept asking himself, had the object of his operation so mysteriously avoided him? Why? Yet for the British too, the operation had finally failed at the last moment through the Canadians neglecting to notify their Coast Guard. Red faces all over Ottawa. For London and Ottawa, the situation would appear somewhat less disreputable when shortly thereafter U-536 was sunk by British and Canadian destroyers while attacking an Allied convoy northeast of the Azores on November 20th, 1943. Room 39 had wanted to let the breach of the German letter code, which it made at the beginning of the U-boat war, ripen into a fruit that would count. Except for the breakdown in Ottawa, presumably it would have so ripened. Had Haida been able to exchange the pre-arranged light signals with U-536 in Chaleur Bay, the Allied action against the boat and the escapee would have succeeded. The basic British plan had certainly proven sound. It had brought a great success almost over the threshold: the capture of a U-boat. It was sheer bad luck that at the decisive moment an Allies' omission had spoiled it. At least the subsequent sinking of U-536 near the Azores was a retroactive consolation. Then there were the failures. Soon after the beginning of the war, cockfosters had learned through interrogations that German U-boats could dive deeper than 185 meters. The British submarine staff and British submarine constructors dismissed this information as unrealistic, however, and British depth charges continued to be set for depths of up to 185 meters. German U-boats profited from this and could evade depth charges set to shallow. Then, in August of 1941, an unhoped-for stroke of luck came to the assistance of the British. They unexpectedly captured U-570, which saw service from 1941 to 1944 as HMS Graf in the Royal Navy. Its hull was composed of steel of a strength whose utilization in submarine construction had previously been thought impossible. Now, hoping to make up for lost time, the Admiralty acted upon the information received earlier from cockfosters and had depth charges set to depths of more than 200 meters. How right this was later emerged from a report by the Anti-U-Boat Division of the Naval Staff on July 5, 1943, in which the destruction of U-202 was described. It says in part, "It should be noted that U-202 was probably of similar construction to HMS Graf, being built at approximately the same time and under the same conditions of mass production and prefabrication. Graf could dive to 800 feet, which is 266 meters, in an emergency, but examination of her hull has shown that this depth is dangerously near the collapsing point for strength. Furthermore, her pumps were only designed to work to a pressure head of 400 feet of water." Another instance of the Admiralty's disbelief of information from cockfosters concerned the guns of our Narvik-class destroyers. German prisoners had spoken of their carrying guns of 15 centimeters rather than 12.7 centimeters, which had been customary for destroyers until then. However, the Admiralty held that this would be completely impossible for a ship of only 2,400 tons and did not even notify the home fleet. In 1944, a destroyer of the Narvik class fell into British hands. Inspection revealed that the British experts had been wrong to doubt. In the third case, cockfosters overheard a sensationally strange-sounding piece of information while bugging some of Bismarck's enlisted crewmen as they were talking among themselves: that die Seekriegsleitung originally intended to bring Bismarck back to Germany through the English Channel after her repairs in a port in western France. Cockfoster speculated the knowledge possessed by these enlisted men must be based on things that had been spoken of on board. Certainly, there was no more Bismarck, but could not such a train of thought, presumably the fruit of long and serious consideration, be put into practice someday with other German ships? However, Room 39 found the idea to be absurd and did not forward it. Except for such oversight, the British Operations Section might have made dispositions that would have stood in the way of the subsequent Channel dash by Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen. If you've ever wondered what being a German POW in British captivity during World War II was like, here you go. It's interesting to see how the British made decisive efforts in intelligence gathering by eavesdropping, interrogation, as well as undercover agents. This is something that Germany almost completely lacked at the time, and it shows during the entire war. We also get a glimpse of some crazy clandestine operations that were being undertaken, like the plan to extract German naval officers by U-boat from Canada. This would be perfect for a spy novel. Anyway, we'll see how it goes on for Burkard in the next episode, and I will see you then. Cheers, bye bye.